The title of this year's conference is Women in Leadership, Designing Your Future. And I think before we can design a future, we should probably take a good look at the past and the present. But the problem with looking at women in leadership in the past is that the history does not give us a lot of role models. Many of the women who rose to leadership in the olden days did so mainly by outliving all the men around them. First, there were the queens you've all heard of, Elizabeth I, Victoria, Catherine the Great, who rose to power by outliving all the men around them. And then there were the warriors, Joan of Arc, Grace O'Malley, the Irish pirate, also Nakano Takeko, one of the only known female samurais in Japan. And then there were the warrior queens. And my favorite is Queen Boadicea. You may not have heard of her, but she was queen of the Iceni tribe in Britain. Now, you know when you invite a professor up to speak, you're going to get the lecture. Well, but I want to tell you a little bit about her. It was a time of the Roman conquest of southern Britain. And Queen Boadicea, and you may have heard her referred to as Boudica, ruled the Iceni tribe alongside her husband. His name was King Prasutagus. Now, Boudica was a striking-looking woman, and she was described as very tall, and the glance of her eye most fierce, and her voice harsh. A great mass of the reddest hair fell down to her hips. Her appearance was terrifying. Definitely a lady to be noticed. Well, the trouble started when her husband, Prasutagus, he was trying to win the favor of the Romans who had just invaded, and he decided it would be cool to make the Roman Emperor Nero his co-heir, in case he died, co-heir with his daughters, so that his considerable kingdom and wealth would be protected by the Romans. And he hoped to keep it all, safe. But that didn't happen. After Prasutagus died, his lands and household were plundered by the Roman officers and their slaves. And they weren't even happy doing that. They had the widow Boudica publicly flogged and her daughters publicly defiled. Other Iceni chiefs suffered in a like manner, and their families were treated like slaves. So, not surprisingly, these outrages provoked the Iceni and other British tribes to rebel against the Romans. And at first, they had a lot of successes. And Boudica was leading the charge because she was really mad. And she started having a lot of successes. And they captured the hated Roman settlement at Colchester, and the Roman division there was routed. And the imperial fleet was fleeing to Gaul. And she led it in a war chariot with her two daughters on either side. Well, the big showdown took place in AD 61. The Iceni were greatly outnumbered, not likely to win, and the resolve of the soldiers was growing weak. So Boudica and her daughters got in that chariot, and they drove round and round. They didn't have PA systems in those days. And She was encouraging the soldiers to fight and to stay in the battle. And she cried that she was descended from mighty men like them, but she was fighting as an ordinary person. And she even played the gender card. When the men kind of didn't want to go fight, she'd say, look, win the battle or perish. I am just a woman, but I'm going to fight. Now, y'all can go live as slaves if you want to. Well, you know the rest of the story. So she exhorted them, and they fought the Romans, and she fought until she could fight no more. But in so doing, she secured a special place in British folk history, and she's remembered for her courage. The warrior queen who fought the might of Rome. And in a way, she did get her revenge, because today, if you go to London, there is a bronze statue of her riding in her chariot with the two daughters on either side, and the statue is placed right on top of the old Roman wall. In more recent history, women have been recognized more for their individual accomplishments than for their leadership. People like Florence Nightingale, founder of modern nursing, also a social reformer, and I did not know this, a statistician. Annie Oakley, the sharpshooter. Helen Keller, the author, lecturer, and the first deaf-blind person to hold a bachelor's degree. Or Rosa Parks, whose single act of bravery earned her the title of the Mother of the Freedom Movement. It's only been recently that we started seeing women leading larger groups. Today, we have Angela Merkel, Chancellor of Germany, Janet Yellen, head of the Federal Reserve, people like Sheryl Sandberg, Mary Barra, and Oprah Winfrey. And here's a bit of trivia for you. I noted, as I was doing my research for this talk, that in 1914, Jeanette Rankin of Montana was elected to Congress 4 years before women received the right to vote. So that was really impressive to me. So that was then. Today, and you've heard some statistics earlier, women have outnumbered men on college campuses since 1988. They have earned at least a third of the law degrees since 1980, were fully a third of medical school graduates by 1990, and since 2002 have outnumbered men in earning undergraduate business degrees. Perhaps surprisingly, they've not moved up in positions of prominence and power in America at anywhere near the rate we would have expected. It's now estimated that at the current rate of change, it will take until 2085 for women to reach parity with men in leadership roles in our country. In a broad range of fields, our presence in top leadership positions as equity law partners, medical school deans, corporate executive officers remains kind of stuck between 10 and 20%. And that seems consistent across industries, including universities. Now, while you may look at that as poor performance, considering where we were just a generation ago, I'd say we've moved mountains. I think the important question before us today is not whether we can make it to the top. It's what we're going to do when we get there. We commonly use the image of the glass ceiling to describe the unseen yet unbreachable barrier that keeps minorities and women from rising to the upper rungs of the corporate ladder, regardless of qualifications. The good news is this, and my Dean of Science has confirmed it, Glass will break when you slam into it with enough force. On the other hand, sometimes it breaks with devastating consequences, creating jagged shards that spray out in all directions. So as a veteran of many of the wars that brought us to this day in history, I offer the following plea. When you have broken through the glass ceiling, and you will, do everything you can to smooth the way so that the one behind you can get through without getting hurt. As a woman in leadership, designing your future and the future of others, I urge you to do two things. And the first will be a little contrarian, but bear with me, is to maintain your womanliness. There has probably been more conversation about gender and gender roles during my lifetime than any other time in history. It would take longer than I've been allotted today to outline the scope of the role of women, but rest assured there are plenty of books on the subject. When I finished college, there were few professional opportunities for women. My generation fought for equal rights in the workplace. We went to law school, we became doctors, we broke the glass ceilings and worked our way into the boardrooms. They called us feminists, among other things, but the effort benefited generations of women to come. But I submit to you today that there is a difference between feminism and womanliness. Feminism is a theory that many of us support. Womanliness, in my opinion, is an even greater calling to which I can only aspire. To me, being womanly means embracing the virtues commonly associated with females for generations: self-possession, modesty, caring. To me, being womanly is not the opposite of manly. It is instead the opposite of being a girl. I believe we do not become women when we have our first period, or start wearing a bra, or finish college, or get married, or have children. We become women when we make our first decision to set our selfish interests aside in favor of a greater good. My mother was one of the most amazing women I've ever known. She grew up during the Great Depression, the oldest girl in a family of 5 children. They lived on a farm and struggled, like everyone did in those days, to make ends meet. My grandfather was a surveyor and was gone a lot. My grandmother was in very poor health with a rheumatic heart and struggled to keep up the household. At one point, it was decided that she could no longer care for her children, so they were divided up and sent to live with relatives. My mother and her 2 younger sisters stayed with an aunt. Her brothers went to live with other relatives. And it was a very dark time in her life. Every Sunday, though, the children were taken to visit their mother, but were cautioned not to say anything to upset her, lest they hasten her death. One day, after such a visit, as they were leaving, my mother broke away and ran back into her mother's bedroom, and she threw herself on the floor, and she begged her mother to let them stay. And she promised that she would cook and clean and take care of the little ones if only they could have their family back together. Heartbroken, my grandmother told the relatives to bring her children back to her. And the next morning, my grandmother had her bed set up in the kitchen. And from there, she taught my mother what she needed to know to run the household. My grandmother lived to see her youngest child finish high school, in part because my mother made a womanly decision at the tender age of 9. Second piece of advice I give you today is to keep up your courage because you're going to need it. Some years ago when I was teaching in London, we took a 10-day holiday in Ireland, and we found ourselves in the seaside town of Galway. We stayed at a local guest house where the owner, Mrs. Gohagan, made it her business to feed us good home-cooked meals every day and totally spoil our youngest son, Danny. Mrs. Gohagan was a woman of great good humor who responded to life's hardships with one memorable motto: cheer up. It's not so bad. You could be lost at sea. And we adopted that as kind of a family mantra. A flat tire, cheer up. You could be lost at sea. You know, a problem at work, cheer up. You could be lost at sea. A rise in property taxes, cheer up. You could be lost at sea. So just how bad is being lost at sea? According to Mrs. Gohagan, it's really bad. But sometimes I think, no, I know. Good things can come from even the direst situations, even being lost at sea, if we keep up our courage. The 27th and the 28th chapters of the New Testament book of Acts offers many of those lessons, including the benefit of not becoming discouraged while lost at sea. Therein, we read about a time when the Apostle Paul was being sent to Italy as a prisoner aboard a ship. They ran into bad weather, and Paul warned them not to go on, but the captain ignored his advice, and they soon found themselves in real trouble. The passage reads as follows: "Next day, out on the high seas, again and badly damaged now by the storm, we dumped the cargo overboard. The third day, the sailors lightened the ship further by throwing off all the tackle and provisions. It had been many days since we had seen either sun or stars. Wind and waves were battering us unmercifully, and we lost all hope of rescue. With our appetite for both food and life gone, Paul took his place in our midst, and he said, 'Friends, you really should have listened to me back on Crete. We could have avoided all this, but there's no need to dwell on that now. From now on, things are looking up.' And at that point, he began to encourage the crew. He told them to eat and to gain strength, and they made it safely to the island of Malta, where Paul healed the father of the headman on that part of the island. And in verse 10 of chapter 28, the writer tells us, 'We spent a wonderful 3 months on Malta. They treated us royally, took care of all our needs, and outfitted us for the rest of our journey. They kept up their courage, and they lived to tell the tale.'" I'll close with one of my favorite stories about keeping up one's courage. Now, I'm told it's true, and I hope it is. An elderly woman, about my age, decided to take up jogging for fitness. As she improved, she thought it would be nice to enter a 10K race, and so she did. And it was one of those big events that included a half marathon and a marathon with thousands of people gathered and participating. So the race began, and somehow, because she'd never been in a race like that, she managed to take the wrong turn, and she was following the path of the marathon. 10K, 6 miles, marathon, 26 miles. So instead of running a little over 6 miles that she had planned, she actually ran the 26.2 miles of the marathon. So when the media heard about that and about her remarkable accomplishment, the local television station interviewed her. And the reporter said, "What was going through your mind when you realized you were in a marathon and not a 10K race?" And she answered, "Well, when I got over the shock, I said to myself, this is not the race I trained for, and it's not the race I entered, but it's the race I'm in, and I'm going to finish it." And I did. I wish you all the best as you finish your race. For me, there's no turning back. Thank you for listening.